right, thank you for joining us this week on the Steve Schramm Show. Excited to have your ear for another week talking about the Christian life and apologetics, how we defend our faith. Got a super exciting interview coming up for you in this episode with Dr. Michael Behe. But first, I want to remind you that this show is brought to you by the Creation Academy. You can get there by going to creationcourses.com. And there you'll find all sorts of courses that we are in development for. You can find our Creation All Access program that you can get in on for about $34 per month. Get access to new and upcoming courses that we make available, and all of the courses that we have there. So you can buy them one-off, and we're adding more over time. Or you get access to all current and future courses for $34 per month. So I invite you to join us over there at creationcourses.com and check that out if you're so inclined. All right, well, listen, I had a wonderful time interviewing Dr. Michael Behe. And let me tell you what, I don't want to take up too much time at all before diving right into this interview. We went a little over an hour, but he absolutely knocked it out of the park. He answered lots of questions from me about his new book, Darwin Devolves. And let me just say right up front, you need to get a copy of this book. It's a wonderful book that will help you understand the limitations of Darwinian evolution. The better we get at science, the more falsified Darwin's theory becomes. Now, you're not going to hear about that in popular science publications, but Dr. Behe has taken it on and does a great job making that clear for us, both in the book and in this episode. Let me tell you real quick about him. Dr. Michael J. Behe is professor of biological sciences at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, and he's a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. He received his PhD in biochemistry from the University of Pennsylvania in 1978. Behe's current research involves delineation of design and natural selection in protein structures. In his career, he's authored over 40 technical papers and 2, but now 3 books: Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution, and The Edge of Evolution, The Search for the Limits of Darwinism, and of course, his newest today, Darwin Devolves, which argue that the living system at the molecular level are best explained as being the result of deliberate, intelligent design. The books have been reviewed by the New York Times, Nature, Philosophy of Science, Christianity Today, and other periodicals. Darwin's Black Box was internationally reviewed in over 100 publications and named by National Review and World Magazine as one of the 100 most important books of the 20th century. So to say that we're happy to have Dr. Michael Behe on with us is absolutely an understatement. So without further ado, here is my interview with Dr. Michael J. Behe. All right, Mike, thank you so much for joining us today on the Steve Schramm Show. We are absolutely delighted to have you.
I'm delighted to be with you and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really, really great. I've already been talking up the book a little bit. How long ago did it come out? It was just last month, right?
Yeah, well, February, 6 weeks or so.
February, about 6 weeks or so ago. So I'm losing track of time, but that's really exciting. So this is your third, call it, major book in the intelligent design community, and I don't think anybody here is a stranger to your work. I've talked to many people who have read your previous books and are certainly excited about this one. What I found really interesting is your books kind of build off of one another. You kind of, in a roundabout way, talk about the same thing, but as we get more evidence and more ability to look into these questions, it seems like the whole paradigm of Darwinism just seems to crumble with every new book that you write.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's just following the rule that the more we know, the less likely Darwinism is. He started. He wrote his book when nobody knew about the cell, or it seemed like a little piece of jelly, and nobody was sure if molecules really existed. And so over time, and especially in the last 20, 30 years, our knowledge of life at the foundational level has exploded, and I've been able to kind of tell people about that.
Yeah, that's awesome. The interesting thing is nobody really seems to know that. I think everybody, the popular mainstream kind of thinking is that Darwin had all of this figured out 150 years ago, and we're just a bunch of dinosaurs stuck in the Stone Ages or something arguing against Darwin. It's like it's a settled fact.
That's right. But he offered a really simple theory, natural selection on random variation. Turns out it's so simple that you can kind of twist it around and try to make it fit anything. And people kind of fool themselves when they think that Darwin's theory is explaining something, when actually what they're just doing is trying to fit whatever they can into this kind of rickety framework.
Yeah, and you mentioned, I loved some of the examples of that you gave in the book, but I'll tell you what, we'll probably talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Why don't we kind of start at the beginning? I gave you some questions that I thought might be good questions before we ever got on the call here, and basically what I want to do, in a sense, is walk through the story of your book. You mentioned a couple of really helpful points all throughout. It was a great read. I absolutely enjoyed myself thoroughly getting to read it. I hate it took as long as it did for me, but I'm a slow reader, so it took me a couple months to get it down and really take the notes I wanted to, but I enjoyed it. So why don't we start kind of at the beginning? If you could just give us like a really brief history of Darwinian evolution. You mentioned something in the book about Darwin's first theory and Darwin's last theory, and I really wasn't even clear on that before you enlightened me through your book. And then also, if you'll just briefly mention the role that Sir Alfred Russel Wallace played. You mentioned him in your book as well.
Sure. Yeah, well, most people know the general outlines that, back in the 1800s, Darwin was a young naturalist, and he went on an ocean voyage on an exploring ship and visited South America and the Galapagos and so on. And it was a time of great exploration. And he saw things that he didn't see back in England, different kinds of animals that seemed unique to their places. And he kind of puzzled about that. And eventually he came up with this theory of evolution by natural selection and random variation. And in a nutshell, it just says that, well, if you've got a population of some animal species and some of them differ from each other, and if one of them, if the variation helps an animal survive, then it will tend to survive and leave more offspring than others of its kind. Mm-hmm. And the offspring, if they can inherit this trait, then they'll have a better chance too. And eventually the trait will take over the species, and then maybe another improvement will come along, another help will come along, and over time then perhaps the species will change considerably. But there's a number of ideas packed into his theory. It's not just one idea. It's got the idea of random variation and natural selection and common descent and a few others too. And I write about those in an early chapter in the book. But there are a couple of other assumptions that are even more critical to Darwin's theory than those, and they rarely get talked about. They're kind of assumed. And the first one, which I dubbed Darwin's first theory, I talked about the other ones, the normal ones, as Darwin's middle theories, just a little nomenclature there. And his first theory is that random variation could supply whatever was necessary to build complex systems like, birds' feathers and fish scales and so on.
Yeah.
And he didn't assume that because there was evidence to show that it could, but rather because he assumed that that God would not provide it, or rather, I should say he used the argument from evil to say that, well, he didn't think God would make a world in which there was so much predation and animal suffering and so on. He used a famous example of a wasp that preyed on caterpillars and laid its eggs within caterpillar bodies, and they'd grow up and paralyze the caterpillar and eat it from the inside out. That all sounds kind of, like fun to me, but but Darwin, he didn't like that. And so he says, I can't think that a good God would set up such a system, and therefore is deducing the result from this. Therefore, I see no reason why the eye had to be designed.
Ooh.
So he made this assumption that because of the problem of evil, God wouldn't have done it this way, and so therefore something like his theory had to be true.
Yeah,
and,
not just on that point. Not much has changed. I mean, as I talk to people in apologetics kind of circles who don't believe in God, as I talk to them, they say some of those same exact things today. Well, God wouldn't have done it that way. Well, I don't know that, so I'm not sure that you know that either. But that's besides the point.
Yeah, and I read in the book that if you read the Bible, the ancient Israelites didn't seem to think that the fact that there were wild animals that would eat you when you went out for a walk showed that there was no God. They just thought that he was sovereign over all of life, all of creation.
Sure.
And his last theory, so that was Darwin's first theory, that God wouldn't have done it that way. And the last theory is really very interesting. It's that not only is there random changes in natural selection, but they can add up step by step to make even the most complex biological system. So that, one step comes along, one random change, and it's favorable, and another one, and they add up to make such things as feathers and gills and scales and so on.
Right.
And again, there was no evidence for that, and it's just kind of the imagination of Darwin and his subsequent disciples. But neither of those, neither that the first assumption or the first theory or the last theory, ever get mentioned when people talk about Darwinism. They're kind of built into it.
That's a good point. And this might be an interesting point to put this in here, but a lot of people don't realize that there's a huge gap between believing in even universal common descent and the mechanisms that are leveraged to marshal evolution. In other words, you, for example, hold to universal common descent, I believe, and yet you reject Darwin's theory of evolution. And so whether or not universal common descent is true, you affirm it, I don't. But that's not even the question before us here today, really, is where we're headed.
Sure. That's what I was saying a minute or two ago when I said that Darwin's theory has a number of different ideas all wrapped up in one.
Yes.
And two of those important ones, as you say, are random mutation, natural selection, and common descent. But a number of scientists before Darwin had advanced the idea of common descent. Maybe animals and plants are descended from earlier versions, but it was always a purposeful process. It was always teleological. It was ordained by God or directed by God or something. But Darwin's claim to fame is not the idea of common descent, but that it occurs completely mindlessly, that nobody is directing it. There's no teleological principle. There's no guidance. And in my way of thinking, that is the most important claim of Darwin's theory. Common
Right.
descent. Common descent. Well, that's interesting. But even if you think it's true, then it just says, well, there were ancestors in the past who had some feature, say wings or something, and there are descendants that have it too.
Right.
Well, that's great, but it doesn't explain how it got there, and
Right.
it doesn't explain how new things arise.
Right.
So it's all in the random mutation and natural selection. That's where the philosophical and scientific the major points are right there.
Yeah, yeah. So that's interesting, and that's of course where we're headed. Now I'm going to take a detour on a couple things here before we get to the real biology of the situation, because I want to just talk about a couple of the other underlying things that you set the stage with in the book. One thing is Alfred Russel Wallace. A lot of people don't know that Darwin's theory, I guess, had what you would call a co-founder or a co-discoverer. And a lot of people think of Darwin as what Dawkins, dubbed having the ability or giving us the ability to become intellectually fulfilled atheists, because that was essentially the view that Darwin argued from. But Wallace was a Christian, or at least a theist, and remained that way for the rest of his life, as far as we know. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Around the same time as Darwin was exploring South America and other places, Alfred Russel Wallace was in Indonesia and Malaysia, in the jungles there, living with natives and so on, and he thought of many of the things that Darwin did. That is the idea of random changes in natural selection, and a couple of years before Darwin actually wrote Origin of Species, Alfred Russel Wallace wrote him a letter and says, hey, I have this idea. And he outlined pretty much what Darwin said was his own theory. So he was thinking exactly along the same line. But the big difference, as you say, is that Wallace never thought that natural selection and random mutation could explain everything, and especially he didn't think it could explain human intelligence, the human mind, and speech and art and so on, and many other things too. I think the human hands and he always viewed natural selection not as a creative or building process, but as a process of elimination, getting rid of organisms that didn't fit in. So here you have, and Alfred Russel Wallace is given the title the co-founder of the theory of evolution. So here you have the very co-founder of the theory of evolution, who in our day would be called an intelligent design proponent.
Right.
So
that ironic?
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes to show you that there was a whole lot more involved there than just the evidence in concluding, as Darwin did, that he had solved everything.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, most people, everybody knows who Charles Darwin is, but virtually nobody, especially in popular circles, has a clue who poor Brother Wallace was. And so, I find that a shame, because I think if people knew more of the history, they would perhaps come to some different conclusions about it. That might be a good point to mention. One of the things you said in the book is that you were reading an academic journal one day, and you found yourself listed as a villain alongside none other than Joseph Stalin and Osama bin Laden. Now, that's interesting. I've only been talking to you for a few minutes now, about 20 minutes, and I don't get the sense that you are like either of those men. So, personally.
You don't know my hidden side.
Well, that may be true, but what is it that's motivating, I guess, in your mind, this harsh attitude in academia towards Darwinian critics?
That's an excellent question, and I have some guesses, but ultimately I don't know for sure.
Right.
But it's clearly the case, number one, that there's been bad blood between Darwinism and religious people for a long time who haven't accepted much of his theory, and so there's kind of this historical baggage. And another one is that many scientists, including most biologists, want Darwinism to be true. They don't want there to be any outside agents involved in life. And that's one reason is can be philosophical, but another can be kind of simply professional jealousy, that they want to be able to explain all of their subject matter, kind of like physics and chemistry wants to be able to explain all of their subject matter. And let's see, I had one more is that it's a bit of a defensiveness, that when they're challenged, they want to be able to say that, no, they have everything under control. And so when somebody, especially somebody who knows a bit about the topic, when they say, no, I'm looking at the evidence and I'm unconvinced, then people can get furious, because that kind of puts them, quickly on the defensive. Because if this person who knows the area pretty well says that he sees problems, then what's the matter with you? Why don't you see them? Or he's essentially saying you're wrong.
Right.
So it's complex.
It is a complex issue, and it's a shame, especially. And this isn't something that I'd even planned to mention, but later on in the book, you said something that kind of startled me. You said that the reality is about 1/3 of professional biologists are Darwin skeptics.
That's correct. A lot of biologists think Darwin's theory can't explain everything we know, or even a lot of what we know, but they're casting around for some other naturalistic, materialistic theory to replace it. And they have to kind of walk a fine line, because they want to try to find this new theory, and they probably are optimistic or hoping that they'll get honors for doing so. But nonetheless, they don't want to give aid and comfort to the enemy, or they don't want to be perceived as doing so by their colleagues. So they can't diss Darwin's theory too much. So they've got to kind of use flowery language and say what a swell fellow he was, but that he didn't get everything correct, they would say. And so we have to add to his theory.
Sure.
But in reality, it all has to go pretty much root and branch, except for, little small things near the surface of biology. So these folks that are casting around for additional stuff, they're going to remain frustrated forever.
Well, and the sheer irony is that even all of these new attempts, they kind of rest upon the foundation still that Darwin laid. At least that's what it seems to me. And yet Darwin didn't even have the ability to assess the question of whether or not the claims he was making were true. I mean, they were mere assertions. They weren't arguments that he leveled, really. They were just assertions because he couldn't have proved them.
That's right. He just essentially laid out some speculations, and it was a real break from the science of his time, which was tried to be rigorous to really demonstrate and predict and show your predictions come true. And Darwin was pretty much spun a lot of stories.
Yeah.
He gathered some facts that would support it, or would, if the theory were true, then the facts you might expect them to be the case, but it certainly didn't show cause and effect.
Right.
And as you said, he didn't even know how much he didn't know. He didn't know the process of inheritance. Most people forget, but Darwin and all of the scientists of his time didn't know how traits were inherited. They didn't know about DNA. They didn't know pretty much of anything.
That's amazing.
And Darwin proposed a theory that whereby little imaginary particles called gemmules were given off by all parts of the body and gathered in the reproductive cells, and it was totally wrong. And he hadn't the foggiest idea about things that we now know are the basis of biology.
Wow. I mean, and this doesn't require too much comment, but I mean, it looks like, given what we know now that he didn't know then and how much different things are, I mean, it looks like you'd almost have to be embarrassed. I mean, to rest upon those laurels. But anyway, while we're on the sociological subject, in the book you mentioned a few of the red flags, and I don't know if you have, just one or two of those you want to talk about. The one that if I can remember correctly, that I'm really interested in is when people just kind of wave the wand of evolution over things, because I hear this all the time. I'm a productivity nut and like a personal development. I just really like that stuff. But so many people who talk in those circles, everything, they just have to mention evolution. They just have to do it. And there just seems to be no good reason why. And you talk about that a little bit in the book.
Yeah, I do. It's kind of a gratuitous invocation of evolution. Anybody who reads a magazine or newspaper or something that talks about biology is going to run into sentences like, well, the ostrich is the tallest bird in the world, and it has evolved to be able to run very fast, and the word evolved in there, doesn't do any work. You could say, and the ostrich runs very fast.
Yeah.
Why use that word in there? And it's even in biology, textbooks and so on, for even the most severe problems, the genetic code or something like that. But nobody has a clue how that could have come about, but you'll read in textbooks that the genetic code has evolved to be, very elastic and allow mistakes to be tolerated, and so it's this gratuitous invocation. But in many of those things, you can just leave out the word evolve or its derivatives, and you have as much information as you had before. It's kind of just saluting Darwin's theory just to show our bona fides.
Wow, that's amazing. It's useless, really. It's useless. It's not even information. There's no information content in those words. It doesn't tell you anything different about. There's nothing. No new information added to a sentence that says that the ostriches evolved to run that way. It's
right,
just
exactly.
meaningless. So
there have been no studies of how a big bird would be able to start slow and run faster, or what the nerves, the changes in nerves would have to be, changes in muscles and bones and so on. It's all just in the imagination.
Wow. Well, there are 2 or 3 more, I think, of those sorts of red flags that you mentioned in the book. And I'm not going to let you give away all your secrets here, because I want folks to go buy the book. But I promise you, the others are just that good. It's really, really interesting. So, by the title of the book, I think it's pretty obvious to see somewhat where this is going. If we haven't mentioned it yet, of course, the title of the book is Darwin Devolves. Now, you take at kind of this breaking point, you open the book up by giving us some of the background and some of that sociological stuff, and then the next parts of the book are more concerned with getting to the biology of the matter. But the first thing you do before you get there, which I appreciate, is you take a whole chapter to basically just marvel at how extraordinary of biological systems and structures, etc., we have discovered in the past, recent history, and even, 20, 30 years, we've been slowly discovering more and more things, and the more we discover, the more impossible it seems for Darwin to accomplish what he said his theory could. So I'm interested, if you would, just to take a minute, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the design we see in nature. And I'll remind everybody that when Dr. Behe mentioned Darwin's first and last theory. By the time of that last theory, one of the assumptions that he had in there was that we would be able to successively see natural selection and random mutation build upon itself, essentially, to come up with these elegant structures. So what are some examples of some of the engineering, you might say, that we find in the biological world today?
Yeah, well, a number of things have been discovered in the past few decades because new techniques, new machinery, instrumentation, and so on has become available that lets you see deeper. Science depends on its machinery. It's like when the microscope was first invented, we could see that there were bacteria and compound eyes on insects and so on. Well, new video equipment, new microscopy equipment allowed some scientists in England about 5-7 years ago to look at a tiny insect called a plant hopper. And this plant hopper can jump even further than grasshoppers can. And it was known for a while that it had, or one of its young stages, its developing stages, had these bumps on its hind legs, and nobody knew what they were for, and figured, well, there's just rough areas there. And but these scientists were able to film this insect jumping and film it so closely that they could see what was going on. And it turns out that the bumps weren't just bumps; they were the teeth of gears.
Whoa!
There were intermeshing gears in its hind legs, and when it started to jump, it turns out that it's so small that a nerve impulse that goes down to its legs, which essentially tells it to start to jump, could arrive in the two legs at different times, and that would cause it to tumble if one leg started before the other. So these gears make sure that as one starts, it starts to push against the other one, and the two can coordinate.
Gosh.
But pictures of this are available on the internet, and I remember when it first came out, there were whole lots of theological discussions going on about plant hopper gears. And that's because it's so clearly designed that you just can't ignore it.
It kind of reminds me of like the fine-tuning argument that you usually hear for something like the universe, but on literally a microscopic scale.
Yeah, and if those gear teeth were not just placed just right, that would make it worse. It wouldn't help it at all.
Wow.
Two gears that are out of sync, that doesn't help a machine run very well at all. So. Yeah, it's crazy, but and these are things that we have just discovered in this one in the past 10 years.
Wow. Is there another, one of the classic examples I think of is the bacterial flagellum being essentially an outboard motor.
Yeah, that's right. And I wrote about that in 20 years ago in Darwin's Black Box, and people were astounded then, but in the meantime, science has uncovered a number of other motors. Turns out that bacteria have all sorts of different ways to swim, and one that I wrote about I like is that some bacteria have multiple flagella. They have 7 flagella in a group, and they all rotate to help it swim more powerfully. But since they're all rotating in the same direction and they're so close packed, they would kind of rub against each other. If you can imagine two gears going clockwise and they bump against each other, then the one side of one gear is trying to go up while the other one's trying to go down.
Wow.
But these bacteria, the ones that use this, have interstitial gears. They have little counter-rotating gears between the flagella, and that allows one flagella to rotate clockwise, while the counter-rotating gear is going counterclockwise, and the next flagella can go clockwise again.
Wow.
So it's crazy. William Paley in the beginning of the 1800s wrote about the finding a watch in a field and knowing it was designed. Well, turns out that's getting to be literally true. We are seeing that at the foundation of life, that there's literally these mechanical devices that have to use gears and pulleys and motors and so on to work.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, you titled that chapter "Fathomless Elegance," and I think that's just about the best title it could have been given.
I intended it. I had a double meaning. That it's fathomless because there's no end of it.
Right.
You keep discovering more and more, and it's fathomless because it's hard to wrap your mind around it. Because there's so much. There's so much to just discover and know.
Sure, and we one of the things you talk about earlier than this in the book is the pretense of knowledge. This idea that we've got it all figured out, and I just here we are in 2019, and later on in the book, I'm kind of meshing some ideas together. But later on in the book, you talk about the progress that we've made in such recent years, and I can't imagine what 20 years down the road from now what we're going to know. That is truly fathomless to me.
What you can make a firm bet on is that there's plenty more left to find out. That the complexity, the elegance, goes on much further than we now know.
That's amazing. So. Moving on, there have been new attempts, we've mentioned this briefly, but there have been some new attempts to kind of, I should maybe start with this, is those biologists who have reckoned with the fact that Darwin's mechanism, they don't feel is going to cut it, and we will talk more specifically about that in a moment. But you mentioned that there have been some attempts to come up with new ideas that don't that supposedly circumvent Darwin's mechanism. Some of the ones you mentioned in the book are evo-devo, natural genetic engineering. I think that's Dr. James Shapiro's suggestion. You mentioned a few of these in the book, and certainly we don't have time for you to explain them all right now, but you ultimately, after explaining all of these, you come back to one really simple reason why all of these ultimately fail to solve the entire problem that you're attempting to fix, or at least to make clear, to elucidate with this book, Darwin Devolves. So can you kind of explain why ultimately none of these alternative theories are going to answer the question that Darwin's theory raises?
Sure. The basic problem, the problem that everybody has to explain is how was the elegant and complex machinery of life produced? How was the eye produced? How was the bacterial flagellum produced? And Darwin's answer was, in general, was random mutation and natural selection. Mm-hmm. These other theories that have been developed more recently are supposedly additions to Darwin's theory, and they mostly appeal to things that we've discovered in the cell. For example, you mentioned evo-devo. There are mechanisms in the cell in place that help organisms develop. There are essentially blueprints and crew chiefs and foremen of construction crews that are responsible for deciding the timing and the placement and the deployment of all sorts of different supplies and machinery to build the shapes of animals. And the proponents of Evo Devo say, well, if we kind of rearrange those a bit, maybe they could make differently shaped animals. But they never explain where that complex system came from in the first place. How did the first evolutionary developmental regulatory system come into being? They essentially leave that to Darwin to explain. And the same with the natural genetic engineering. It's very interesting, and maybe it does explain something or other, but it doesn't explain where the complex machinery of the cell came from, that the cell itself uses to essentially manipulate some of its own components. And they don't explain where that came from, even though they try to use that to say, well, maybe it can change things or it can help evolution somehow.
Right.
So none of them, except for Charles Darwin, and except for another crazy theory about the multiverse, none of them try to explain the complex machinery, what I call a purposeful arrangement of parts.
Yeah, I like that. I think I lost count of the times I read the words "don't even try to explain" in italics throughout the book, because essentially what we've got here is just this assumption of, oh, well, we know we got to this point. Now let's see how we can take it further. Sure. But nobody assesses that original question or even attempts to get at it, and that's really ultimately the problem. So that brings us really to what I read as kind of the climax of the book. I mean, I got to one page where I finally just underlined and starred all over the thing so that when I come back to it, I'd be able to find it again. You talk in the book about what you call the family line, and you give the example of ironically Darwin's finches and also a species of fish called cichlids. I think that's how you say that. Can you maybe talk, and we're really getting down to the meat and potatoes here, can you talk a little bit about the family line, what it is that you discovered in your assessment of the new evidence?
Sure. Yeah, I think most people have heard about Darwin's finches, the Galapagos finches.
Yes.
One of the places he stopped on his travels around the world were these islands, the Galapagos, which are on the equator off the coast of Ecuador, a couple hundred miles. And he saw that there were finch species there that didn't occur anywhere else in the world. And he wondered how these little isolated islands might have gotten, up to a dozen or so species of finch just for themselves. And this and other things kind of led him to the idea of the theory of evolution by changes and natural selection, that the idea was some birds flew there a long time ago, and over time they specialized. Some had got larger in size, some smaller, some specialized on seafood, other on seeds, and so on, and then accumulated different shapes. But it turns out that these days, you can tell a couple of things. That the finches on the Galapagos Islands belong to 12 different species, and the species are grouped into 4 different genuses. Mm-hmm. It turns out, if you remember back to high school, the levels of biological classification starts with kingdom, and then phylum, and then class and order, and so on. And genus and species are the 2 lowest levels of classification. Mm-hmm. If you can, I write in the book that you can think of it in terms of numbers, place values in an 8-digit number, because there's 8 major classification levels.
Yes. And
I said, I wrote, think of it in terms of a sum of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's 6 figures, and cents, dimes and pennies columns. And if you think about it, the finches then have only changed, even granting Darwin's idea, they've only changed in the last two columns, the pennies and dimes column. And the finches are supposed to have been have arrived on the Galapagos 2 million years ago.
Right.
So in millions or hundreds of thousands of generations of these things, with supposedly fierce selection, random mutation, all they could do was change the crummy cents column of this large sum of money. And I write in the book that even the IRS, and we think about that this tax season, but the IRS tells you to round off the cents in your figures on your tax return. And if we did that with the finches, then all of this touted variation would be disregarded. It's really trivial changes, even over such a long period of time. And the same with this group of fish that you mentioned, the cichlid fish, that they're all over the world, but in a couple of lakes in Africa, there are hundreds of species that are native just to those lakes. And many evolutionists have pointed to it and said, behold the power of natural selection. We got hundreds of species in just this one, or several lakes, nowhere else in the world. But again, there are hundreds of species, and there's maybe 50 or so different genera, but there are no new categories higher than that. And the next highest category after genus is family. Mm-hmm. And so I argue in the book that Darwin's mechanism does work, but it can't change an organism into something that differs at the family level from its ancestor. And just to give folks an understanding of that, family difference is kind of like cats versus dogs.
Right.
So those had to be designed at least down to the level of family, the cat family or the dog family. And after that, well, maybe some random changes and selection could fiddle around the edges, but down to that basic level required purposeful, intelligent design.
Yeah. I mean, I love that, and frankly, and I know we differ on this point. I appreciate that the most intelligent design advocates really just focus on that level of design. It's not really even a question about the age of the Earth, and I don't even want to go there, other than to say that for the first 60 or so episodes of this very podcast, all we talked about was different things about young Earth creationism. It used to be a young Earth creationism exclusive podcast, so I still have a lot of listeners who are exclusively young Earth creationists, as am I. And any young Earth creationist, frankly, who reads this chapter is going to start shouting up and down for joy, because this is the kind of thing that we've thought for a while. And so, frankly, we were quite happy to have you say, that yes, that past the level of family we don't change. But frankly, I like the way you've got it because what you show is that even assuming a timeline that many Christians do agree with, even though some of us don't, even assuming that long timeline, regardless of what the time is, you're saying that changes past the family level just don't seem possible by Darwin's mechanism, is really what the evidence shows.
That's right. So even granting the premise that the Earth is billions of years old and things have been changing all this while, you still can't get a dog from a cat or vice versa.
That's amazing.
So and that's kind of not the half of it. I go into in that same chapter to talk about the genes that have been shown to affect finches, the variation in finches, and only one has been really tracked down, but it's the difference between a functioning gene and a gene that has been degraded, that is, that works less well than it used to. So these changes aren't even, they're not building things, they're simply degrading genes, things at the molecular level.
Sure, sure. And frankly, I mean, that leads me to the next thing that I wanted to kind of discuss with you quickly here. What you begin to talk about, and this is kind of the essence of the book, Darwin Devolves, is that these touted factors that supposedly are the very drivers of evolution, namely random mutation and natural selection, you actually show in the book that these are ironically two of the three factors that limit evolution. They don't help it. They, as a matter of fact, are the very thing that keeps it from moving forward. Now, so you mentioned two of them in the book, random mutation and natural selection. And the third one, which I wouldn't mind for you to discuss very briefly, is something you've already dealt with at length, which is irreducible complexity. And anybody who studies origins certainly has heard about that. But you gave an illustration in the book about a hot air balloon. And I don't claim to know all the science behind that, but essentially the illustration you give is that it's actually the very mechanism that causes the balloon to rise off the ground in the first place that keeps it from flying off into the upper atmosphere. And I thought that was a very helpful analogy. So can you just a little bit talk about how it is that random mutation and natural selection actually limit evolution?
Sure, yeah. Well, it's only, again, been the past 10, 20 years that we've developed the techniques to determine this, but in the past, scientists could see, or breeders could see, that occasionally there'd be a change in an organism, and maybe it'd help or something, and that organism would be bred, or it would take over a petri dish or something like that. But they couldn't figure out what the change was because they didn't have the ability to look at the molecular level, at the level of DNA. And it's important to remember that mutations are changes in DNA, changes down at the molecular level.
Sure.
But people have 3 billion DNA letters in their genome, and trying to find out which one changed is a tall task.
Yeah.
But it turns out that we can do that now, and to make a long story short, almost all of these helpful changes are ones that break or degrade pre-existing genes.
Huh.
They're not building anything new, they're breaking old stuff.
Yeah.
And many folks at this point say, well, wait a second, how can it help to break something? And if you think as an analogy, suppose your life depended on your car getting a little bit better gas mileage. What could you do to help it get a bit more gas mileage? Well, one thing you could do is take out the back seat and throw it away.
Sure.
Take off the hood of the car, throw that away, lighten it. And, those things are useful in many circumstances, but if your life depended on you getting better gas mileage right now, then that would be the way to go.
Sure.
And that seems to be what's going on with, in many of these cases, even the iconic examples of evolution. It turns out to be devolution more than it is evolution. It's changed by degrading stuff, not by making stuff.
Wow. Yeah, that really that overturns the whole thing. Really.
It sure does.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about one of the things in the book is that you're just so much more likely, even just, the analogies are helpful, but just looking at the biology and the mathematics of it, you're just so much more likely to come across something that could break the existing system than to build up something entirely new that it's like it just can't even get off the ground for breaking itself.
That's right. Yeah, it turns out that, mutations that break something will occur, hundreds or 1,000 times faster than a mutation which might even in theory be constructive. And that's simply because proteins and genes and so on, these molecules at the foundation of life, they're complex machines. And like other complex machines, maybe your car or your computer or something, if you take a hammer and smack it, there's a lot more places that you can do damage to it than you can improve it with a hammer.
Yeah.
And same thing with the protein. And so if hitting it with a hammer and breaking something off, say you knock off that hood of the car or something, if that helps, then you're off to the races. Then natural selection will grab that helpful change, even though it's a degradative change, it's helpful. Natural selection will grab that and spread it throughout the population so that now the whole population is doing better in the circumstances, but they're degraded a certain amount, and they're a little bit more fragile than they were too.
Yeah, and really what you bring this to is you actually coined, perhaps you'll go down in history for this, but you actually coined a little a scientific law to kind of put this succinctly, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. Well, I had a head start though. There's a law called Dollo's law.
Uh-huh.
Dollo's law is from the 19th century, and it simply said that if a species loses some ability during its evolution, like say penguins have descended from seabirds, but they can't produce flight feathers now. If they lose that ability, Dollo's law said, then they will never regain it. And turns out I talk about some recent molecular experiments that looked at something like this, and they saw that not only can't it regain something, but that you can't go forward either. It's hard to go from a past state to a future state. So I call that Dollo's timeless law.
Yeah.
In the original, it was saying you can't go back again, and pretty much Dollo's timeless law says, and you can't go forward either by random mutation and natural selection. There's no privileged position for the past or the future in the Darwinian mechanism.
Yeah.
And so it applies equally to future changes as well as to past changes too.
Yeah, and actually
there's a lot of
you spend a whole chapter just on that, so I would definitely encourage everybody to pick that up just to kind of get the rationale for that. But you also have what you call the first rule of adaptive evolution. Is that right?
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
That as well.
Okay, yeah, you're right. I've coined so many laws. I'll tell you, I should be a legislator or something. The first rule of adaptive evolution is if you're an organism that's trying to adapt to a change, it is to break or blunt any gene whose loss would allow you to produce more descendants. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a reflection of that, what we were just talking about the fact that it's much easier to break a gene than it is to build up a gene. So that means that it's faster too, and the fastest change, the fastest mutation to arrive on the scene that will be helpful will rapidly be grabbed by natural selection and spread throughout the population. But since degradative mutations are the fastest ones to arrive, then that means that most adaptation, most evolution will be by degradative mutations.
Mm-hmm. So what we really have is that random mutation and natural selection, which are touted as the primary drivers of the Darwinian theory, are really degradative in nature. And the fact of the matter is that those changes will get made. Those degradative, I guess I'm saying that right, changes will actually take place far, far sooner than anything even remotely constructive would.
That's right. I was just going to add that, and once you kind of spend that genetic patrimony, your inheritance, then you don't have it to adapt to another change in the environment, and so eventually an organism gets stuck. So that's how random mutation and natural selection, they promote evolution at little levels, the species and genus, by using the first rule, by breaking stuff, but then they get stuck, and so they can't go any further than the family line.
Exactly. Oh, I love that. I love that. And of course, we don't have time today to discuss irreducible complexity. Of course, you devoted an entire book to that. I believe Darwin's Black Box was entirely about that, essentially, wasn't it?
Yeah, pretty much.
Pretty much, yeah. So there's a really helpful summary in Darwin Devolves of the arguments about irreducible complexity, which for the listeners, there might be some people who have not heard of that. You just want to give a couple sentence summary of what you mean by irreducible complexity? That might be helpful.
Sure. It's just some system that has a number of different parts, and they all interact to do something, to do a function. And if you take one away, then it doesn't work. And the example I always give is a mousetrap, a mechanical mousetrap. Yeah. You've got a spring and other metal parts and a little wooden base and so on. Take any one of those parts away, it pretty much is broken. And the problem for Darwin's theory is if you had to evolve something like that gradually by many steps that were improvements, it's real difficult, surprisingly difficult to see how that could happen. And even worse for Darwin's theory is that the cell is run by machinery, sophisticated machinery that very often is irreducibly complex. So it becomes real difficult to see how the machinery of the cell could be put together in a gradual fashion, like Darwin insisted.
Yeah. So in my mind, that really just compounds the problem. I mean, you've got the mechanisms that he proposed itself that are shown to degrade things before they will ever construct anything. And then to compound the problem, in my mind, you've got to figure out some way for these things to build even more complex structures and even structures that depend on other parts of the structure to work, much like a mousetrap has independent parts that work together. You take one away and the whole thing collapses. So that just compounds the problem, really.
Yeah, that's right. And that's because he essentially just barking up the wrong tree.
Right.
It was a good try, but it does not work, and so it's time for some different thinking here.
Sure. Now, I'd be remiss not to mention for a moment the Lenski study that you mentioned. This is essentially, it's pretty common. I think a lot of people know about it because it's been going on for some time, but this is essentially the largest and longest observable study that has ever been conducted on evolutionary mechanisms. Is that right? And it certainly it doesn't seem to be helping us. We still have a bunch of bacteria.
It has been going on for 30 years, and he's been growing bacteria in his lab. And since they grow so fast and they're so small, there has been an enormous number of generations of these things, 60,000 generations of bacteria, and trillions of them over the time of the experiment. And he has seen that they have improved, that they grow faster, that they can do other things that help them kind of edge out all the other cells. And but when our ability to sequence DNA has improved, he's been able to track down those mutations, and it turns out that all of them degrade or break genes. That there have been dozens and dozens of these mutations, and they all break or at least degrade the gene that they occur in.
Right.
So this is the very best evolution experiment that's ever been conducted, and it points very strongly to exactly what I argue in the book.
Sure, sure. Well, that's encouraging, for all of us on this end to know that there is someone who has undertaken the test, and certainly, I don't think he's terribly thrilled. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I mean, he still is a Darwinist. I mean, he's still an evolutionist. In fact,
Yeah.
he has written one of the critical responses so far to your book. However, I'm going to let you address that in just a second. But ultimately, what his study implies is exactly the thesis you argue for in the book. So that's interesting.
Uh-huh.
So in the final chapter of the book, you kind of take us to what you believe to be the reason why there is not, nor can there ever be, a naturalistic mechanism to account for significant biological change. Now, obviously, because you are a proponent of intelligent design, I don't think it's any secret that you believe purposeful design to be by a superior intelligence. You believe that to be what is responsible. So that's no secret, of course. But what is it that tells you that it's design that we find in nature? I mean, even back to Paley's watchmaker argument. I mean, what is it really that we see working together to tell us, oh, this is design? Design is actually detectable. But how do we know that?
Well, it turns out to be. It sounds kind of philosophical and esoteric, but it's really pretty simple. And if you look in the dictionary, one of the definitions of design is the purposeful arrangement of parts. And so we recognize that there has been design, or that a mind has caused things to come together whenever we see a number of different parts, number of different components ordered to each other so that they can do something, so that they have a purpose, or they can do something beyond themselves. And, and that sounds pretty fancy, but just think back at the mousetrap. Everybody who looks at a mousetrap would realize it was designed, even if you haven't seen it before.
Sure.
Because you see the parts that are set up, and they interact with each other to do something. And same thing with writing. If you look at a book, then you can see the letters arranged so that they do something. They're not just a jumble of ink on paper. And it turns out that this is the way, the only way, that you can recognize that another mind besides your own exists. I give an example in the book of a Frenchman who was an editor of a magazine, and he had something like a stroke, and it left him with a condition called locked-in syndrome, where he was utterly paralyzed, except that he could blink his left eye. Ooh. And he set up a code with a nurse translator, and he dictated a book about his experiences, which was published and was a bestseller. But if you looked at the fellow in the bed, even though he's a human, even a person, you'd just see essentially a vegetable, or an inert body, and yet here was we can tell that he's not comatose or anything, because he can blink out in a purposeful way his own story. And then this goes then in life as well. In life, life is just chock full of purposeful arrangements of parts. As a matter of fact, if it weren't for that, there would be no life. Yeah. And so I argue that we can know, that's how we detect that a mind has acted from this purposeful arrangement. So we can know that a mind made life, and we can also know that no mindless process could do that, because a mind is needed to order things to each other, because a mind can have purposes, and a mind can pull things together that it can manipulate in order to fulfill its purposes.
Yeah, and that, by the way, thank you. That's a great summary. And the fact of the matter is, what you really argue for is that if we give up this notion, then philosophically, and this is admittedly more of a philosophical chapter, we're left with something like solipsism. We give up the ability to detect other minds if we want to say that what we detect in this new molecular world that we've discovered, if we wanted to try to claim that is not the purposeful arrangement of parts, then we just have lost the ability to detect mind. Really,
that's exactly right, and it may surprise listeners, but that idea is spreading pretty quickly in academia. That in fact we don't have minds. Not only don't we have minds, but we might just be figures in a computer simulation, or we might have other very irrational basis. But the point is, if you can't attribute a purposeful arrangement of parts to a mind, you quickly lose the ability to recognize even your own mind, and you start to doubt your own self, your own soul. It's impressive that people can be talked out of their minds, but in academia it happens.
To save Darwinism. I mean, really, to save what Dawkins called the only way that you could have an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And of course, I'll remind everybody that it was even Dawkins who said that biology is essentially the study of those things that look like they're designed on purpose. It's hard to deny this, and so indeed, the denial of it just leads to ridiculous kind of suggestions. So the last thing, and I know we're right on time here. We're needing to wrap up, but I just want to give you an opportunity, real quick. There has been some critical feedback. As a matter of fact, there was some critical feedback. I believe that was published by the journal Science, or I can't remember exactly if it was Science who published it even before the book came out. They were already ready to go with some responses to you. What of the critical feedback? I mean, has anybody sunk your arguments yet, or what? What's
Well, you're asking an interested party, but in my completely neutral opinion, no, they don't even try to sink it. The Science Review, Science is maybe the second leading journal in the world after Nature. So it's really up there, and the reviewers, at least one of them was a prominent scientist, Richard Lenski himself, whose work we talked about.
Yes.
They didn't even address the arguments. That it was really kind of bittersweet for me. I liked it because it showed they didn't have an argument against my ideas, but it was bitter because they didn't tell anybody else about it. They just railed for their 700 words or so. They said, well, Behe says that that random mutation stuff can only break genes, but we know about this, that, and the other thing. And with those arguments, they point to examples that either are irrelevant or are question-begging because they don't know if Darwin's mechanism produced changes that they point to, and they criticize me for not responding to past criticisms of Darwin's black box and my other book, The Edge of Evolution, but I had, in fact, written lots of stuff responding to all those arguments, and they just waved it over. So it was really astounding. Again, let me just tell any listeners that the science battle has been won. Darwin's theory simply can't account for what we found out. The only battle left is the essentially public relations and sociological battle.
Sure. And I'll add to that I for the life of me, I can't remember if it's DarwinDevolves.com or if it's DarwinDevolvesBook.com. the website
No,
for
it's DarwinDevolves.com.
DarwinDevolves.com. Yeah, if you go there, not only can you find the book and everything there, but actually everybody there at I guess it's you or the Discovery Institute, who's ever handling that, is actually keeping a track of the critical reviews and reactions and your responses to them. So I would really encourage anybody who's interested in it, because what Mike here is talking about is 100%. I mean, it's documented. I mean, he's not just throwing stuff at you here. The reality is you can literally see them. And Mike has written some of the responses, and others of his colleagues have written some of the responses. But they'll point right to where he's responded to arguments that the critical feedback says he hasn't responded to, and so it really makes you wonder. Is there a counter argument here or not? And that the second largest science journal in the world, with some pretty prestigious names attached to the review, couldn't immediately refute such a foundational argument. That should be really telling. I mean, like Mike said, the science battle has been won.
It won.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Mike, listen, I so much appreciate your time. We went a little bit longer than we had planned to, but you've been a sport, and I very much appreciate you giving us your time for a few moments. DarwinDevolves.com, you can go right there and check out the book, and I hope that you will keep Mike in your prayers. He's certainly been a force to be reckoned with in the intelligent design movement, and he is certainly putting himself out there along with his colleagues to bring this idea that Darwin doesn't have the goods to the main stage. And slowly but surely, Mike, it seems like it's working a little bit at a time.
Yeah, so, faster these days, I think, as
yes,
science progresses.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Mike, thank you so much for your time. You've been very gracious to us, and we appreciate that. We're praying for you.
Thanks a lot, Steve. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, friends. Well, that was obviously a wonderful, wonderful interview with Dr. Behe. I hope you enjoyed your time listening as much as I enjoyed recording it. He was excellent to fellowship with, and just a true gentleman, and hilarious guy, and super, super knowledgeable, knows what he's doing, knows what he's talking about. And so that was a great conversation. There's not much more I can add to that other than make sure to go get the book. DarwinDevolves.com. You got to go get the book. Check out. I mean, there's a couple of appendices in there, and the book itself is a great read. It's a long read, but it's a great read, and I highly encourage you to go pick it up. It will change your perspective, probably, or at least widen your perspective on a lot of key issues. All right. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and say a prayer. Close up for today. Dear Heavenly Father, we love you. We want to say thank you so much for what you allow us to see in your world, Lord. We even are allowed the ability to detect that there are other minds other than ours, not to mention yours, Lord. Thank you for allowing us to be able to discover you, not only through your revealed word and your revealed Son, but, Lord, through the revealed world that you have given us as well to study. Thank you, Lord, for revealing yourself, Lord, in nature. We love you and want to say thank you for the many opportunities and blessings that you've given each one of us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, folks. Well, I hope you will take time to join us next week right here. Same time, same place on the Steve Schramm Show. Hey, a couple things. Don't forget, you can head over to our Facebook group by going to steveshram.com/community. You can join up over there and talk about the episodes each week as they come out, etc. Of course, you can go to creationcourses.com, the sponsor for this episode. Go out there and check out any courses that we have available. And anytime you're looking for any of our podcasts or videos or articles, any online resources, you can just go to steveshram.com to find all of that stuff there. All right? So many blessings to you. We'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.